their systems, the shamanic systems, was to make sure that the scum didn't rise to the top. Because that's the shaman's job, is to watch and police the children and the adults to see where the pestilence is. This was one of their great roles, by the way. The Druids were very good at it. Once you remove those guardians, those keepers of truth and wisdom from society, well, then you're in severe problem. You have severe problems. This is what also happened during the witch burnings and all of these other genocidal acts. And then by the creation of this hierarchical model, you're allowing the impure to rise to the top. And you're screening them step by step to make sure that their conscience, what we call conscience, is slowly and slowly compromised. Or that even their physical life is compromised. There's ways that this is done. We'll look at that a little bit later on. In the Architects and Control, we went again into a definition of psychopathy in order to understand all of this. And look at it a little bit different than the rest of the world's psychologists. Because there's many definitions of this. And I was very concerned that in all the definitions that do exist of psychopathy, very little has to do with anything to do with historical trauma. This part has been left out by philosophers and psychologists alike. But I think it's very, very important. And it ties into this. Now, if we look at some of the symbolism, you'll see that great efforts have been put into designing cities and, state buildings, colonial buildings. Here's Buckingham Palace seen from the air. And there you can very clear, it's upside down, but you can clearly see the pyramidical aspect there. Not that pyramids, their shape is any negative, any more than a triangle is negative. It's just that this means something. It symbolizes the hierarchy. Here's Washington, D.C., you see. Again, it's Buckingham Palace from the air. A total Egyptian pyramid concept. Here's Hampton Court, which is not far away. Another elite estate, deliberately designed on that motif. Here's Canberra. The same idea. You're finding this cropping up a lot. Here's the ancient, not the ancient, but during Nazi Germany, this was the Nazi, was meant to be a supposed Nazi headquarters, designed specifically by Himmler to be a pagan shrine, and also a settlement for elite Nazis, Wewelsburg Castle in Germany. The same motif, the same pyramidical idea. Or it can be in a different form, not quite pyramidical, but for instance like here, the headquarters of the EEC, you see. It can be this sort of Tower of Babel effect. But even obelisks, all sorts of statues. And the idea is that hierarchy, basically, I've always said it's a definition of psychopathy. Because it's almost it's a hallmark of psychopathy. Those people who see the world in hierarchical terms are working from a certain level of dementia. It's not to say that hierarchies don't exist. But when your ideological model of the world is hierarchical, then we enter into lots of problems. And so when we decode the symbolism, we find out there's an awful lot of emphasis on this. The idea that there was some disorder in the past. A new world order implies an old world disorder. Even to talk about order, right? Talks about imposing something on something that's disorganized or disorderly. And Masons use even the symbol of the beehive. You'll have symbols of the tiara, of the mitre that the popes wear. This symbol of hierarchy can be found in many, many levels, symbolically. Joel Bacan says that democracy is necessarily hierarchical. It requires that the people, through the government they elect, have sovereignty over corporations, not equality with them. Now he's talking about in the corporate milieu. If corporations and governments are indeed partners, we should be worried about the state of our democracy, for it means that government has effectively abdicated its sovereignty over the corporation. And corporations, in his work, he goes in to show that they are psychopathic. If you read his book, The Corporation, he's talking about corporations being psychopathic. One of the commenters on this kind of a certain psychopathy was Nikolai Machiavelli, and he has to say that a prince, and this is somebody aspiring for political power, ought to have no other aim or thought, nor select anything else for his study than war and its rules and discipline. For this is the sole art that belongs to him who rules, and it is of such force that it not only upholds those who are born princes, but it often enables men to rise from private station to that rank. So he's encouraging the elites to think in psychopathic ways. He goes on to say that from this arises the question whether it is better to be loved rather than feared. For feared or feared rather than loved. It might perhaps be answered that we should wish to be both. But since love and fear can hardly exist together, if we must choose between them, it is far safer to be feared than loved. There's your psychopathy. There's your conscious, deliberate decision-making and advice. Sorcery, it's specifically then, I paraphrase Carlos Castaneda's Don Juan, who says, as a sorcerer, you are aware that you have absolutely no control over or of anything, but you have to act as if you do. Now what that really means, interpreted, is mean that you have no control over yourself, which is the point I've been making. The psychopath has no control over their own selfhood. Their own inner republic is in a state of total chaos. And therefore now they need these very sort of stabilizers in their own life, and then you just continue by imposing those on the world outside you. The same point is brought up by Thomas Hobbes, the philosopher. In the 16th century, he said that the state of peace among men living side by side is not a natural state. The natural state is one of war. And there's whole schools of philosophers who believe that, and many schools of politicians. And of course it's an ancient ideology. The old idea of crushing and subduing nature is born out of this idea that man in his own brain imagines himself the highest of the species and all of this nonsense. We also have it come about, this whole phallic idea, the ethiophalic hierarchical idea also comes about in patriarchism and the whole idea of phallocracy, the patriarch. Another manifestation is the idea that you rise yourself by pushing others down, right? You can't really rise yourself morally, spiritually, intellectually. So you remain exactly where you are and make sure that everyone beneath you is artificially pushed lower. This is how the tyrant works. And then they have this aura of superiority. Whereas the truly spiritual, superior man develops on his own, regardless of what others are doing. This is impossible to these psychic invalids. Demeaning nature, demeaning femininity. All of this is part of it. The treatment of animals and so on. Again, it wouldn't be a problem. Only thing is that they want their infection to spread. They're not just comfortable, as we see from these quotes, being that way themselves. They must make the whole world as wretched and as disorderly as they are themselves within their minds. This must never be forgotten for an instant. Now, you can't come out and tell people that that's what you're going to do, so you come out as the wolf in sheep's clothing to give them all these promises. First, you create the problems, like we've heard, right? Create the chaos, create the mayhem, and then bring in the idea of artificial order and artificial control. And you will buy into it if you have the same infection within. So it's all about psychic and psychological immunity. Nothing to do too much with politics, even though you can't rule out political action out altogether. And here is the perfect statement that summarizes what we've been talking about. This idea that the psychopath craves this artificially imposed order. As George Bush said, George Herbert Walker Bush, he says, out of these troubled times, our fifth objective, a new world order, can emerge. A new era, freer from the threat of terror, stronger in the pursuit of justice, and more secure. Today, a new world is struggling to be born, a world quite different from the one we've known, a world where the rule of law supplants the rule of the jungle. When you decode this psychologically, it's unbelievable what kind of specimen is revealed underneath it. If you just think about it as being something that's happening in external theater of the world, then you don't have the understanding at all.